In a world that's chock full of misinformation and disinformation, do you ever wonder how to tell if a source is credible? People start looking for sources of information almost as soon as they start interacting with others. Young people learn in real-life contexts. They give different weights to different sources of evidence. And if a parent is telling them, you need to put a coat on because it's cold outside, that's going to be different than that information coming from somebody else who they might not necessarily see as reputable. Something else that's important to consider is the relationship between confidence and accuracy. As young people are exposed to people who are consistently accurate, they come to trust those people over time. People who are confident but inaccurate, young people come to sort of mistrust those folks. Similarly, people who speak conditionally about what they know, like perhaps it's this or perhaps it's that, those people tend to be, increasingly viewed by youth as trustworthy if that information that they're presenting over time is accurate. We perceive information emotionally as opposed to sort of rationally. So before we encourage people to dig into single sources of information, what we'd really like them to do is to engage in a process called SIFT, rather than to sort of dig deeply into a piece of information that may not necessarily be credible and accurate at all. What we should do first is to stop, think about our emotional response to what we're looking at, and identify exactly what it is we're looking at. From there, we say, okay, what is the nature of this source of information? Investigate it. Where did it come from? Where was it published? How was it spread? And then, really importantly, the F in the process is to find other sources. So set that information aside and then look for other sources of information that corroborate with that. So once you've sort of found other sources, the objective there is to then say, relative to the claim that's presented in these sources, how can I trace this back, if possible, to the original context in which this source was created and in which this information was spread? I think we have to address mis and disinformation as if it's kind of a public health crisis. An important role of the teacher is to establish a kind of climate of respect and trust among each other, so that kids can compare what it's like in this classroom with people of different perspectives in comparison to what it's like in society, where mis and disinformation, proliferate and are used in ways that are not necessarily in keeping with the way that we ought to behave together. So classrooms can be really good spaces for establishing with kids, this is how it ought to be. This is how we ought to work together around information. For example, can we agree in our classroom that we're going to seek out accurate information about science and politics and history and culture because accuracy is important to me and the people that I care about? Can we agree that fact-checking is an important process and that it's not the same as censorship, and we can explain to students what that means and why that's the case? So in other words, establishing a set of sort of fundamental principles that we're going to use as a way of thinking together about information throughout the school year, and then returning to those principles over time as new cases show up. Another thing that teachers can do is to engage in pre-bunking or inoculation. So there are common practices that exist within misinformation and disinformation. Things such as scapegoating, appealing to false expertise or what have you. You're going to come upon these methods of manipulation and you can be ready for them. So I'm going to pull up the tweet related to Hurricane Helene. What you see is a picture of a child on a boat with a puppy after all of the damage had been done. The person who posted the tweet indicated that this is a sad scene and their heart breaks, and just below what you see is an audience correction where they say this is an AI-generated image, it's not real. It's very easy to generate mis and disinformation using AI, so these kinds of images are likely flooding social media all the time. After that correction was made, the person who posted that image responded and said, I don't care if this is a real photograph or not, I'm going to leave this image up because it represents what people are feeling and experiencing. That's an especially dangerous thing too, because essentially what people are saying is, even if something is inaccurate, as long as it represents some kind of experience that I have, it's accurate to me. One of the sort of phenomena that happens when those kinds of images proliferate in online spaces is what's called an illusory truth effect, which is that eventually it becomes true as people see it enough, or it represents something that becomes true. What's interesting about that particular image is it reinforces the idea that amidst Hurricane Helene, bad things were happening and public services were not responding, even though local, state, county, and federal resources were activated relatively quickly to help people in that circumstance. I think Jonathan Swift's phrase was, falsehood flies while the truth limps behind it. It takes much more time to cautiously and thoughtfully debunk sources of information than it does for sources of information that are bad to sort of travel around the world. And I think one of the things that we have to ask ourselves as educators is, what are the kinds of classroom spaces that we want to create? Not just learning about the content, but also learning about the process by which we verify the accuracy or credibility of the content. Those two things have to co-occur in classrooms where accuracy and credibility are things that we care about and we want to attend to with kids.